Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. Today's topic is hoarding disorders, understanding and treatment. And we have an excellent speaker. My name is Kim, and I'm with Alzheimer's Orange County, and I welcome you here today, and I will be your host. Our sponsors are bringing us these webinars to us as a service to the community on topics that are beneficial to anyone who is working with older adults or if you're caring for a loved one. And today our presenter, Krista, I'm going to tell you about her in just a few minutes, but first I want to thank our sponsors and then tell you a little bit about our CE requirements. So a warm thank you and welcome to Care Choices Hospice and Palliative Services, O'Connor Mortuary, Caring Companions at Home, and of course, Alzheimer's Orange County. Now I want to tell you about our wonderful speaker, Krista Tipton. She is a licensed clinical social worker, and she's passionate about the intersection of social work and technology, particularly in the fields of aging and mental health. She's a senior social worker at Adult Protective Services, and she's committed to reducing elder abuse through technology. As well, she is the owner of EchoStick, offering consulting and training with trauma-informed care leads. Krista has a master's in social work from Cal State Long Beach and a bachelor's in psychology and social behavior from UC Irvine. Since 2013, Krista's been active with the Orange County Task Force on Hoarding and serves the National Association of Social Workers as co-chair of the California Technology Counselor. And now I'm very pleased to welcome to the webinar our wonderful speaker, Krista Tipton.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me, Kim? I'm going to take that as a yes.
Yes,
Yes,
we do.
yes, I can hear you, Krista. Thank you.
Yeah, just checking. Oh, when I heard that introduction, I realized it's been a decade since I started with the task force on hoarding and did my thesis on hoarding disorder, actually, while I was in my master's. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. I did this training a couple of years ago for Alzheimer's OC, and I'm grateful to be invited back again. Thank you so much for having me. Over the next 45 minutes, I'm going to go over slides talking about hoarding disorder, treatment, innovations, what to look for, what we can do, because a lot of times we feel like, what can we do? What are we allowed to do, right? It can be very frustrating. It can be very compassionate. It can elicit a lot of feelings from us, whether we are providers or family members or people who are in the community who care for people who have this difficulty in their life, hoarding disorder. So we'll go over that, and then we'll have some questions at the end. Happy to answer any questions that I can and share a few stories along the way. So, okay. So the first thing I want to start with, and you should get a copy of all of these slides, just so you know, you'll have them for posterity and to refer back to. But the first thing that I want to talk about is kind of sensationalism and insensitivity in our culture and in the media. I think that hoarding disorder is often very misunderstood, which is why I'm here today. But this is a lot of what we see. We see the TV show Hoarders, which is sometimes like the worst of the worst, sensationalized TV. Jokes like, I'm just a few sheets of scrapbook paper away from being on an episode of Hoarders. Or sometimes even just that schadenfreude of, I watch this to feel better about my house or myself. A couple things on here are just some of those headlines that, you know, are attention grabbing and sensationalistic, but I mean, they can be really kind of harmful. They're not very kind in how they talk about people with these behaviors. They're often like labeling. A lot of times there'll be news stories where they'll confront the person in front of their house without permission. And one of the things to know about hoarding as we go along is that it's not a choice, right? It's a mental health issue. And just like all other mental health issues, it affects the person and affects the people around them. But because there is this physicality of stuff that you can see outside of the person, it's more likely to just be put in the media and just be more of like a community issue. And we'll go over that. So I just wanted to first like clear this out of the way. This is not what we are going to talk about today. We are going to not take it from the sensationalist or perspective, but from that caring and that provider perspective. So is it hoarding? Let's start with the basics. Hoarding is defined as a behavior pattern of collecting and or inability to, sorry, I just realized my video is in the way. Let me minimize that. Okay. It's a behavior pattern of collecting and or an inability to discard. This is what disrupts the lifestyle and the living environment. So most often people hoard common possessions. It's the same thing that we would keep in our own homes, just to a higher degree, right? Paper, you have mail, you have newspapers, you have books. Even if you're not going out and collecting things, we all get a ton of mail coming to our house, right? And so if you have that inability to discard, even if you're not purposely collecting, it's still going to add up. Clothing, because clothing usually can stay good and usable past its fashionable lifetime, let's say. Containers, boxes, bags, totes. I've heard a lot of people collect a lot of like their grocery bags, whether plastic or paper, to a huge degree that most people would not collect that many in their home. Food, sometimes you have a lot of food. There may be an insecurity of food, wanting to keep a lot of food around you. This food may expire, but they may not be able to discard it. So it may just add up over time. They may be eating the expired food, they may not be. Animal hoarding, we talk about it and it's in the news and it's awful when you see it, but it's actually more rare of the types of hoarding that we see. Most of the time, hoarding behaviors are more of like these types of common possessions that this talks about. So, hoarding, or is it something else, right? Sometimes we can say, oh, my home is hoarded or something like that. But in reality, there are other ways to present your stuff. So collections, okay? Some people have 10,000s of different items. I've been across America and on different roadside attractions. The person who has like over 15,000 Chiquita banana items, or you have your Coca-Cola enthusiasts, or people that keep collections of different types of bottles, as you can see here. People usually proudly display their collections, and they usually keep them well organized. Even if it doesn't seem like it's well organized, you can see in this picture how it's not interrupting the living space of the home, okay? And that's the thing. Clutter and collections, they usually do not disrupt the living space. You're not going to see pathways with that type of behavior. You're going to have people who collect a lot of like similar items and maybe multiple collections, but it's not going to be these mixed items. I want to also say that squalor is often combined with hoarding, especially in the previous pictures, or like on Hoarding, or Hoarders, the TV show. Squalor is something different. Squalor is filthiness from degradation or neglect, okay? And that's more of what you will see on this right-hand side picture, right? Where you kind of have like that dirt or the filth, right? Not all people with hoarding behaviors have squalor. And not all squalor has hoarding behaviors. I've been in homes that had complete squalor and were absolutely filthy and uninhabitable, but very, very few items there. I've been in homes that had pathways and a lot of different mixed items that rose to the top of my head and above, but did not have that squalor piece. So they do not always present together, but on TV and in the more sensationalized things, you will see them together. So it is in the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria. It used to be under OCD in the DSM-4, which is our manual for diagnosing individuals with mental health issues and physical issues. This is the diagnostic criteria, okay? Just like any other of the DSM criteria, it really is that a particular behavior rises to the point where it is distressing or impairing the function of the person in whether it's in their home or in their work or another domain. Okay, so really you're going to see someone with hoarding disorder accumulate a large number of possessions or have extreme difficulty discarding, or both. And you find that their use of living spaces is severely impaired, right? You will have sofas that are covered in papers and boxes, or you will have a kitchen stove that has other items on it that, you know, could be, that don't belong in a kitchen, right? Or pathways, right? So that you can't use the living space for how it's intended. So these are the things that you'll see in the hoarding disorder criteria. Now, general facts about it, 5% of the general public, as many as 1 in 20 people may display hoarding behaviors. Of course, like anything else, it's a spectrum. And so you will see people who are mitigating their behaviors or someone else is around them, or something that becomes very extreme. Onset of hoarding behaviors, we talk about it as an issue for older adults, but it's really thought to begin around 13 to 14 years of age. And when you talk to somebody who has these behaviors in later life, if it's not caused by something that came about in later life, like dementia or something else, what you'll see is that they may have started with these behaviors in their own rooms, but maybe their parents were doing clean outs. Maybe they continued to live with family members, partners. They had their own children who maybe, you know, help keep things in check. So the behaviors may have been there, but not have been more to the extreme that we see later on in life. Average age for those who seek or who are referred for treatment of hoarding disorder is about middle age. That's generally the age that you'll see of people who are in support groups and willing to acknowledge and work on the behaviors, or who are able to, not just willing. And I think that a lot of that comes from the fact that if you start with your hoarding behaviors early, eventually you are going to collect over the years, and you are going to keep collecting, and things will continue to, you will have more and more items as you go along. As I said before, hoarding is no longer a subtype of OCD. It's now a standalone diagnosis in the DSM-5. I do want to do a little spotlight on dementia. I will talk about different comorbidities of hoarding disorder. It is almost never just by itself as far as mental health issues. But in special regards to dementia, one of the things that has been brought up in the last 10 years, 15 years of studying hoarding disorder is that it sometimes can be a response to feeling isolated, in which the focus turns to things instead of interaction with others, or to the loss of control of memory functioning, loss of friends, loss of a meaningful role in life. Sometimes we will see hoarding behaviors exacerbate after a traumatic event. It doesn't necessarily mean that that traumatic event caused hoarding behaviors, but maybe they were a little bit more in check, or a scarcity, you know, not as much of a scarcity mindset until there has been a loss. There is also just the idea that as you start to lose your memory sometimes, and there's all different ways that we do that, you know, there is that idea of, I don't know where I put this. I may want to have more of something or have it in multiple places. You will see people sometimes say, well, I came from a generation that understood that, you know, like World War II or, you know, the Great War, like you had to give up everything that you owned right? So you would keep everything. Everything had a use. But not everybody who grew up in that environment or in that situation would respond the same way of keeping items past an amount that would be considered maybe normal in our culture. So when you have this dementia piece, it can be just the fact that you may purchase more things because you don't know where you put it, or there may be this fear of I can't find something. There can be that physical functioning and that loss. So you may not be able to physically remove things from your home in the same way. Also, there's evidence right now that they're looking at that the left temporal lobe is important to compulsive collecting. And so they're starting to spotlight on that. And that means that possibly if we can identify the parts of the brains that are being affected, that there may be further treatments coming from that. And also when you have frontal temporal lobe dementia, that may also have a higher significance of having hoarding behaviors, but they're still studying that. As I said, comorbidity matters. Even though hoarding disorder is its own defined DSM-5 diagnosis, like I said, it almost never comes by itself. So it's important to kind of view it almost as a symptom. And here's why. Sometimes it can occur with major depression. Sometimes it can occur with dementia. Sometimes you'll see it with obsessive compulsive personality disorder, where one of the diagnostic criteria for that is that you tend to keep things because you feel like you need it, and it's part of the frugality of that. Sometimes there's ADHD as well, where you will have people keeping multiple items that are mixed, and you'll kind of hear about it culturally called doom piles, maybe, as opposed to hoarding. But it will have like more specific spaces instead of every single surface covered in a home. I think that the comorbidity informs the treatment and the response from us. And the reason why is because if someone is having more hoarding behaviors when they're having their depression exacerbated, you're not gonna necessarily tell them, oh, well, just fix it, right? They may be just having that physical depression and may not be able to get themselves motivated enough or have the right hormones and brain chemicals flowing that would spur them into doing those behaviors for themselves. Alternately, ADHD, if it's more of a behavior that might be coming from those types of traits, you're going to want to treat it and respond differently, because there are different ways that the brain is having a defect, basically, or a lowering of certain chemicals. And so you're not going to treat the same thing the same way. You're also not going to tell somebody who has dementia, well, just remember where it is, right? Or let's go through it. So the comorbidity does inform that, but there's almost always one. So we're going to talk about the impact on individuals, the community, family members. I'm not going to go through every single bullet point, but I do want to make sure that you kind of have these as your normal things that you may see on a regular basis that kind of, you'll see across a lot of people with hoarding behaviors. There may be physical illness, falls due to the level of things in the home or things covering the floor. Respiratory issues, if you have a large amount of papers or boxes in your home that can collect dust, that can have pests sometimes, those can also lead to respiratory issues. So sometimes you'll see a higher level of asthma or respiratory issues with hoarding behaviors. Emotional despair, when you're having a mental health issue and you don't feel like you can control it and you're trying to hide it, that can really just lead to a despair on your part, a frustration, a fatigue from constantly being in despair from it. Strained relationships, of course, if people are living in the home and being affected by it, or if you don't feel like you can bring people into your home, the social isolation piece. Oftentimes, you'll see people who have hoarding behaviors in their home, but you absolutely would not think to guess it based on seeing them in their day-to-day lives and outside the home. There's financial burden often, paying for storage facilities. I'll see a lot of people with hoarding behaviors not meeting their basic needs financially, but they'll be paying for storage. We'll see people who lose their homes or who are homeless and pay for storage instead of paying for a home for themselves. Alternately, if a home is hoarded and to a point of being a safety issue for the community, the city or the municipality can put it into receivership, where basically they take ownership of the home, pay for the clean out and pay for the repairs, and then sell it back to you. And a lot of times people can't afford that. It can be very expensive along with the legal fees. So that's usually very last thing that you want to do. And just unsanitary and unsafe living conditions, whether there's squalor or not, it'll restrict mobility around the home. There could be other infestations. The deterioration of the home and home value. We've seen the weight of items in a room, about this tall, actually push floors down on a second floor so that the floor is actually caving in. And just a heightened threat of fire as well with the amount of items. Impact on families, if you're living in the home, same kind of physical illnesses, you'll see respiratory issues. Mental health challenges, if you think about constantly having a lot of things surrounding you, there is that claustrophobia, there's the frustration, there's other parts, because it's usually comorbid with another mental health issue that the family member is trying to understand and deal with. So strained relationships, if you are the family member or person who cares about the person with hoarding, keeping them away. Adult children and partners, that can be, very strained relationships. They may not want to come into your home, or they may have anger built up. There is Children of Hoarders online, which is a support group. There's the financial burden as well. For the family members, there can be the cost of clean out after the death of the loved one, a loss of inheritance if it did go into receivership, those kind of things. Impact on community. If you have shared walls, then you are at a fire risk. Those fire walls are there and they have a certain amount of hours. Garages and in-home walls have different fire hours that a fire protection from a fire basically. And so you may store things in your garage, but you can't store the same things in your home. Those walls are not as fire resistant for a long time. There's rodent pest issues if you're sharing walls, if you're in a community or an apartment building. HOA legal issues that can be very difficult as far as mitigating what's going on with someone who's in the HOA. They may have a lot of letters or fees, or the HOA may take on a huge legal burden in order to affect the property that's affecting the whole community. The weight hazard, as I said, it can really dip those floors. Fire emergency personnel safety. If there is not a safe way to get into a home, especially if it's on fire, there are firefighters who have broken their legs. There are firefighters who have lost their lives, people who have lost their lives because fire and emergency personnel can't get them out. In our own work, and I'm sure you've seen this too, where you will have somebody who has pathways that are too small for a gurney to get through in order to take them out if they have a medical issue. And just also the clean out costs. There are task forces. When task forces first started appearing in America, we do have them all over the world. Some of those task forces, meaning well, would pay for a single clean out, and it would take all of the funding just for one instance. So there can be a huge cost to that for the community, for the municipality, for groups that are raising funds to who mean well. Then we talked about, so far we've been covering a lot of things in a short amount of time, talking about what hoarding disorder is, what it looks like, impact on the person, the family, and the communities. And now we're going to get into like the meat of things, I think, which is what we can do, right? How do you approach this difficult issue? And so there's some tips and tricks along with this, but really it is more of like a paradigm, right? A way of shifting our thinking around it to be trauma informed. So number one, when you're encountering a person with hoarding behaviors, you have to remember it's not about the stuff, it's about the person. And we used to have a wonderful firefighter in Orange County by the name of Darren Johnson. He has passed away, but amazing man. He would go into people's homes with hoarding behaviors, and the first thing he would ask them about is, hey, how you doing? Do you have batteries in your smoke detector? And he would talk to them about just having batteries in their smoke detector, making sure that they have the very basics of safety and not even get into the amount of stuff there. Just starting with like the actual person in front of us and not talking about the stuff or having a reaction to the stuff. So it is about the person. It's not a decision or moral failing. We talk about it like it is, but it is a mental health issue, and it is a symptom of other mental health issues as well. With hoarding behaviors, it's important to know that the insight level varies, but it's really often very low or unapproachable. So sometimes you will have people with hoarding behaviors who will say, oh yes, I hoard things. Sometimes you'll have people who will say, well, I clutter a bit, and they'll use their own language for it, however they feel comfortable. But a lot of times, due to the other like mental health issues sometimes, or rigidity of thinking, it's very much like, oh no, I do not hoard. How dare you? And I keep things because they are still good, or I keep things for this various reason. And they will often talk about like minutia or very specific things, but not as a whole about how the hoarding behaviors are affecting them. We see it all across ages, different cultures, different housing environments. There's been hoarding studies all over the world. It is not just Western cultures. It is all cultures have these behaviors and the symptomology. You have all levels of intelligence and socioeconomic status. So you can't assume that, we often have these stereotypes of people where, oh, it's like the professor who is hoarding all of like the data and the papers all of the time, or maybe this person is not intelligent and they don't know what they're doing. It really does span across all levels. To that end, I think that it's important that you identify the person that you are talking to. I have found success in building rapport with people. Let's say if they have a high intelligence, or maybe they were a teacher or a professor or engineer, where they can see a lot of different uses for a single item, then I appeal to them with research and not logic necessarily of, if you clean out your home, then you will be safer, but more about actually how the brain works and why we have these behaviors. And that has triggered some different insight before. So knowing who you're talking to and also what the mental health issue is, their level of impairment, if they are, have moderate dementia, using logic may not be appropriate. It would be more of like an emotional type of conversation. So just really, the desired outcomes of intervention are harm reduction and linkages to mental health. If that's all that you can do, you have done a good job. The reason why is because we all have different ways of looking at our lives and what we perceive to be clean or okay, or how we would prefer to live. And there is self-determination here. So, looking at the harm reduction instead of just a stark, no, let's have perfection is a much better way to go about building rapport with this person. Also, linkages to mental health, because frankly, if it is a symptomology of other mental health behaviors, without treating those, you're not going to be able to get to the stuff, right? So those are really our desired outcomes of intervention, starting with that. Family members need their own supports. I mentioned before that there is a group called Children of Hoarders. There are other different online groups and other places where you can find support for family members, whether they are a family member who was affected by growing up in the situation, or a family member who cares about the person and wants, them to be safe and well. So they do need their own supports. It's not going to be the same for everybody. More research is being done to diagnose and treat this. And, there's multiple task force meeting this week, actually. LA meets later today. Orange County meets on Thursday. San Diego's meets on Friday. So there's a lot of support as well as academic research being done. And it's important to know that interventions can be successful because of the low insight, because of the value and the mixed items often in a home where you will have cash mixed with jewelry, mixed with newspapers. It can seem to take a lot of work, but their interventions can be successful. And we do see successes. So I want to talk a little bit about research and innovation and kind of switch over to some of the more positive things that we're seeing. Awareness is a big part of it. So there's been some studies up in Canada, as one of my favorites a few years ago. They were using mixed reality, which is the augmented reality, virtual reality. They created a room with hoarding and different levels of hoarding in it. In virtual reality. And then they took people with hoarding behaviors and they watched their eye movements. They listened to them. They did qualitative and quantitative questions with them. What they found was that people who with hoarding behaviors often acquire faster than others. So they were able to pick out things much quicker with their eyes than other people without these behaviors. So that was an interesting statistical significance. Difficulty categorizing, which is one of the things you will most likely see. You will see these different mixed items, a bottle next to a paper, next to maybe a can of green beans or something. They showed that people actually had difficulty categorizing. And so if you showed them 30 different types of bottles of drinking out of, right? And you could probably go to your kitchen and see, several right there. They asked them, well, what do you see? And a lot of people without hoarding behaviors would say, well, I see 30 bottles, or maybe I'd see 4 water bottles and 3 coffee bottles and things like that. But people with hoarding behaviors would say, well, I see a blue canister, and I see a water bottle that I really enjoy. And I see this water bottle that reminds me of this time I went to Europe, right? And so they can't really categorize things into places very easily. This is also one of those reasons where sometimes you will go into a person's home with hoarding and you will see that their cupboards may be empty, but they will have a lot of mixed items out on other surfaces like the floor or the counter. And that's because a lot of times there's a perfectionism there too, where you absolutely want to get it right. But if you're having difficulty categorizing, it's really hard to do something perfectly. So they'll have empty drawers, empty cupboards. So something to look out for. That's that perfectionism. Or you'll see empty totes that they are going to fill appropriately, and then it doesn't happen. That's the perfectionism part of it. One of the things that we're seeing, which is really exciting, San Francisco has a wonderful one, are peer support groups. Having peer support is a wonderful program for people with hoarding behaviors because it takes a lot of the stigma and shame out of it and can show some hope in something that has probably been hopeless for them throughout their life. Or maybe people have constantly taken or cleaned out their things without their permission. And so they've become, very shut down to that. So when you have a peer support group, one of the things that they do is try to make it fun. Okay. What we've seen is that in actually the VR process, I did say above it with a bullet point, claustrophobia causes stress. And people with hoarding behaviors, you would think that they weren't exhibiting claustrophobia, but they actually were. And so what happens is that when you are in distress, you are not going to want to clean out your things. You are going to be in that scarcity mindset, and you are not going to be able to get rid of things as easily as if you are in a good mood. So 2 of these pictures here, the San Francisco group, they all wear tutus, and they all schedule times where even when they're cleaning by themselves, they're still cleaning at the same time, because there is that human characteristic of when we are doing things at the same time as others, they may not be next to us, but we still feel like we're part of the community. It elicits the dopamine, the serotonin. Wearing a tutu is fun, it's silly, it lightens our brains, lightens our moods, and they're more likely to discard things. Also, light up shoes, another way of just enjoying yourself when you're doing that discarding, and absolutely celebrating the small wins, because those small wins do build rapport, and build up to a tipping point where someone may be even more likely to accept services. I did say that there were links to ADHD. That's been anecdotal for a really long time, but in the last few years, there's actually been academic research and medical research coming out that part of the working memory deficits can also lead to like those doom piles, difficulty visualizing outcomes. So you may see that perfectionism or not knowing where to categorize and put things away. So we're seeing that with those trait systems as well. All right, so what can we offer? Dignity, right? This is where that compassion part comes in. A lot of times, you know, like you saw, the Hoarders TV show, the jokes in our communities, the sensationalistic headlines, you know, they're very shaming, and shame can be a big part of this, of why there may be a low insight as well. So dignity with that person-centered approach, which I talked about before. It's not about the stuff, it's the person. Use their language to name the behavior, and don't name the person. So, you know, you can use hoarding behaviors. You don't call a person a hoarder, right? If they, you know, I will ask them, you know, like, hey, you got some stuff, you know, and I'll see whether they'll use the term, oh, clutter, you know, or they'll, you know, leave it at stuff. Maybe they may even say, oh, I have hoarding behaviors, but I don't put that on them. I let them come to me with the language that they feel comfortable naming the behavior at first. Therapy, treatment, medication, especially for the comorbidity first. If you're treating that dementia, I'm sorry, if you're treating that depression or the ADHD or the other mental health issues, you know, you're getting therapy for that. Maybe there was some trauma or other things, you know, that is going to lighten things, and maybe then they can approach this stuff. For some people, that stuff is actually used as a wall to protect themselves mentally from other people and emotionally. There was one woman who, when she cleaned out the wall of stuff from her bedroom, she became very, very frightened and put it back. And that had actually been a visual representation of a wall because she had had a history of sexual abuse before. And so that was her brain's way of coping and putting that wall up. So interestingly, not sort of about this stuff, but not really. Cognitive behavioral therapy strategies. I really do strongly recommend that visual representations of the area that's hoarded is very important to have. You can, if they allow you to take pictures, they may be able to see in the two-dimensional picture the amount of stuff that they have or the items that they won't be able to see as they are walking around in that actual situation because of how our brain prunes out the data that it's getting. So two-dimensional pictures can be helpful. Even taping off where you would want those lines to be of pathways so that they have a visual place of where the line is actually. Harm reduction strategies, those are just some of them. The KonMari method, it's a cultural revolution. People have different feelings about it. What I do like about it, the spark joy kind of thing, is that she talks about that when you are thinking things, you're using one part of your brain. When you are speaking, when you are using emotional pieces, that's activating other pieces of your brain. So when you are actually like talking to the items or verbally saying what you're doing, it's engaging a lot more of your brain. Also, structures and rituals that are focused away from the loss of the items and more toward what brings them joy. There's a tool called narrative appraisal where they appraise out of a category of things what their favorite may be. Support groups and information without judgment. Like I said, sometimes you can just give the research to somebody and let them read it themselves, and just coming to people with kindness. A carrot stick approach with support and rewards can work really well. One of those things that was used well in New York in public housing, was if you kept the hoarding behaviors to a certain level, you were given a repainted kitchen and brand new appliances. And it was such a win-win. Alternately, sometimes people will often say no to adult protective services or no to help. And that's when that village approach is important, because then if they are about to be red tagged or something else, then being prepared at that moment to make sure that they have support, right? So sometimes that's how the carrot stick approach works too. And again, family members need their own education and supports to help support the mitigation of it. Strengths-based intervention. Most people who have come to the attention of public services are reluctant to accept help, people with hoarding behaviors, and they've had previous traumas. Surprise cleanouts do not work, and there are legal and ethical issues there, where if somebody came into your home and threw away all of your items, you would assign a value to that, right? Is it legal or ethical for somebody to come do that in your home? Sorting through the items of mixed value, and that can be very time consuming. Churning is a specific term. It is where you start on a pile, and we've all kind of done this in a way where you start at the top of a pile and you're like, oh, I need to remember that. And you set it here. And you're like, oh, I need to mail that. And you set it here. And then pretty soon you've churned through the entire pile and everything is piled back on top of itself again. So doing a lot of work, but not seeing any benefits. Self-determination is key. Like I said, receivership is the last resort. It is very expensive and very, very daunting for the person with hoarding behaviors and the family. Social supports and financial support, often limited. There is some funding and support through Home Safe, through Adult Protective Services referral, if somebody is at risk of losing their housing and meet other criteria through Adult Protective Services. Also peer support, mentors and coaching. That is a volunteer and a way to fund helping people go through their items. Again, time consuming it can be. And shaming does not work. So please build rapport, provide information to increase insight, share tips and tricks about things, lighten it a little bit. Collective impact, it does take a village. It really does. That's why task forces are being created. Different municipalities, even in Orange County, let's say, different code enforcements. We have many here. Different cities have different types of ways of looking at whether you are king of your castle or whether community needs trump the self-determination of a person, right? So you will have different cities having different, they may be much more likely to engage code enforcement or engage like even to receivership much quicker than other cities might. Also resources. Some cities have more resources or different ways of programming. And so also that value of the municipality. Like I mentioned, there's 3 task forces meeting this week in our county and surrounding counties. And there is a hoarding task force network that can be found on Facebook and has its own website. And that is a network to bring together all the different task forces worldwide. In our task force, and all of them are slightly different, we have case presentations. where you can come with a particular case. You don't give the name of the individual, but you give relatively the age and the situation and the city that they're in. And the city members that come and the agencies that come to discuss those case presentations can give you those very specific programs that some cities have and others don't. It really is that multidisciplinary collaboration. So if you're interested in learning more, like to think outside of the box, I like my puns, there's books on this. There's a great book named Stuff that is good for family members to kind of understand the underlying issues. That is not just about the stuff, but it's called Stuff. There's different websites based on this, conferences. There's an international hoarding conference, which is pretty cool. Social media, TikTok, YouTube videos. You have to be careful of that sometimes where you may not get, the best information, but there's still like tips and tricks in there. And local resources. You have support groups with Alzheimer's Orange County. You have the Hoarding Task Force here. You can go, if you are concerned about somebody, you can call Adult Protective Services. There's different agencies that assist. It's also important to know that this happens not just in homes, but people also have hoarding behaviors in hospitals and in skilled nursing facilities. And so, and also even on the street, if they're homeless. I've seen people who have hoarded food and other items in a hospital and kept them underneath them or kept them beside them because those behaviors are what is comfortable for them. They're comfortable in that discomfort. So you can see it in all different types of places. So that's where you really have to get into like that multidisciplinary, where can we have the best bang for our buck and get services and help. Our Orange County Task Force on Hoarding, I said we meet this Thursday. It's a virtual meeting. If you go to ochhoardingtaskforce.org and you sign up for the newsletter, newsletter just went out. You can also email. In the next slide, we'll have an email and be added to that newsletter so you'll know when the meetings are. You can bring case presentations. Questions time.
Okay, Krista, so compelling. I mean, this information is just so useful. You just mentioned that hoarding can happen in residential care facilities. Well, a huge amount of our attendees are coming from the care industry. So I know all of them are really happy to have this information, as are people who are living at home who are perhaps seeing this behavior in their relatives or whatever. But I'm going to go into the question box and start asking questions in just a few minutes. Before I do that, I want to strongly remind everybody of the importance of being aware of implicit biases. And, those are nothing more than unconscious stereotypes that we hold about certain people. So we could have a bias against hoarders, for example. So a best practice is a person-centered approach, as Krista said, where we view each person that we care for as an individual with unique needs and preferences. And we recognize that we're going to treat them with dignity and respect, even though they're very different than ourselves. So if we always listen carefully and respectfully so that we understand their perspectives, values, and preferences, then we can really build trust and provide the highest level of care. Right, Krista?
That's right.
Yeah. So now, before we begin the Q&A, I just want to remind everybody of our wonderful sponsors, O'Connor Mortuary, Care Choices Hospice and Palliative Services, Caring Companions at Home, and Alzheimer's Orange County. All of these folks have been involved in sponsoring our webinars for a very long time. So we thank you so much for that. I also want to remind everybody that next month's topic is going to be an equally fascinating one. It's pain management in dementia care. And we're going to have back a popular speaker from the past, Erin Light, who is the senior administrator at Silverado Silver Living, but she's bringing along Kim Buttram, who is a gerontological nurse practitioner for Silverado. So make sure you save the date of Tuesday, July 11th for pain management in dementia care. Okay, so let me get the questions. I know there's a lot of them, and we'll try to address as many of them in our time frame as we're able. And I think you answered this already. Can hoarding or collecting ever be solved? Meaning, is this going to always be a problem for them that we're going to need to monitor? So can people be cured of hoarding, I think is the question.
Well, it'd be the same as asking if anybody can be fully cured of depression or any other mental health issue. Frankly, our brains wire to them. We have to stop and challenge thoughts, even if we're presenting with really great outcomes. So, is there a full cure? No, it doesn't magically go away, but just like any other mental health issue, it can improve.
Thank you, Krista. Is it hoarding if rarely used items are kept because they don't want to repurchase it because they may need to use it at some point in the future, or they do use it occasionally? Is that still hoarding?
Good question. That does not necessarily mean hoarding. I would ask, is it tucked away into places, or is it all over the floor or surfaces and impeding the normal living space, right? Is it impacting or distressing themselves or others? And I say distressing others to be mindful of that because sometimes we have much higher standards than another person would for something, and the perfectionism can equally be there, but on the other side for the hoarding behaviors just as much as somebody who is maybe minimalist. So I would say that's my answer. I would say it really does depend on if they're just keeping those things around just in case, don't we all? But is it a huge amount of items that's impeding their life?
Okay, thank you. Someone wants to know if you have any advice for them. They have parents that have 4 full closets full of their deceased parents' clothing, none of which is really any good anymore. But is that what would you advise? They claim it's their memories.
Mm-hmm.
Why they won't get rid of it?
So a couple of things for this. I would say, is it bothering them? Do they need those closets? Number one. Is it a pest issue, or is there some sort of like health issue that's coming from those closets being there, right? That just may be where their memories are and they're happy with that, where you might have like a portrait over a fireplace or something, and that's where you hold your memories. To that end, though, if they did want to go through it or something, one way to do that is to take pictures of those items, to keep a memory book where they can still have the visual memories, but not necessarily the physical items. So it could go either way, but I do look at it from that harm reduction standpoint as, do they need those closets now? Or is that just their comfort level for everything else that is going on in the world and that is hard?
Right. Great suggestion about the memory book. What is receivership? One of our attendees wants to know.
Thank you. Receivership is specific, and it can be legally different in every municipality, county, or city. But receivership is where the municipality takes the home away from the person, actually receives it, takes the ownership away, and does with that property what they are going to do within their legal bounds to clean it out, to repair it, to bring it to a community or code standard, and then provide it back legally to the person, with the caveat that all of those fees are now tacked onto that house. And so sometimes the person cannot afford to get their home back. And okay, sometimes they can. So the receivership is that actual legal capability of the municipality to take the home away from that person and do with it what they need to do, and then return it back to them. That's receivership. And it's, every municipality and country is different too, even city. So that's the broad definition.
Thank you, Krista. This question may have been answered, but we can reiterate. As a pastor, I often visit people in their homes. An attendee is stating, if I suspect hoarding disorder and or unsafe conditions, who should I call first? So is that APS? Is it the police? Is it the task force?
So I would say Adult Protective Services If that person is over 60, they automatically qualify for adult protective services if there's some sort of issue. And anybody over 18 who may have a mental health issue or other nexus of a physical health issue. So hoarding disorder is a mental health issue, as well as the other comorbid things. I would say calling adult protective services. I think a lot of people don't quite understand what that means or the legal capacities of that organization. And APS has its own trainings where it's really clear about the self-determination of the person, but also the ways that a social worker can come to the door, offer services, offer resources, work with people. And so I would say adult protective services is a good call. There's also there's different, like St. Jude's Caregiver Resource Center, if you have questions about something. The Hoarding Task Force, not necessarily. It would be more appropriate to go to the website for that and look up some of the resources there. But really, adult protective services has abilities within our penal codes that other agencies do not. And to that end, if you felt like someone was unsafe, then there's also the appropriateness of calling the police if needed, or an ambulance if needed, depending on the needs of that person. But I would say if it's just about the stuff and you're concerned about the safety of the individual in the home, adult protective services is a very good call to make, with the caveat that a person can self-determine and say yes or no. And you may be really surprised who says yes to us and who says no. It's often the opposite of what you might think. So you may think this person's never going to let someone in their house, and they absolutely will if it's a stranger in a particular authority. And others, you would think they would want the help, and they'll say no, and they have the ability to do that. So it's a good place to start.
Krista, do you think that has to do with, you talked about a lower type of insight? I mean, is that kind of the same thing as denial? So if they have low insight about the issue, they might be willing to let people in because they don't really perceive it as a problem. Would that be safe to say? Or
I think that's one flavor of it.
Okay.
There's many flavors. That's why that harm reduction is the way to look at it, right? And really just the more supports that you can encourage them and provide to them, and they will accept to be involved, the more rapport they can build, the more that it can become a little less shaming, the more that they can have a place to start. Like I said, perfectionism can be a place, where people get stuck. So I don't want to necessarily say denial, but that lack of insight often is a barrier to treatment, because if they're having a low insight on the hoarding disorder, they may not even be seeking treatment for the other issues that they may be having that they could treat, more appropriately with medicine or therapy. Start there.
Thank you, Krista. And a couple questions kind of stem from that. One is someone is asking, how and why do people develop a hoarding disorder when there isn't a comorbidity? Like, is there a trigger for it? Or are you...
There can be. It can, if you do look at it from a symptomology perspective, right? It could be a trauma could exacerbate it, but there's often traits there sometimes that sometimes people think that a trauma would cause hoarding behaviors. I don't think that that's necessarily the case, but exacerbate for sure. Or be one way of having a coping mechanism, if you look at it from that perspective, right? And that's a compassionate way you can look at it as well, to see it through their eyes a bit, and know that the research that we're seeing in VR and virtual reality and other studies is that there's still claustrophobia. They're still exhibiting, they're aware of the stuff and it's still uncomfortable, but then the brains are kind of like turning it off and having coping and survival skills there, which is why I also said, please don't take pictures like without their permission and then shove it in their face. But if they are willing to have that discussion, that they may be able to see items in a picture that they couldn't see around them, that's a really good place to start, right? With that insight, my opinion.
Thank you, Krista. Would it be helpful to ask or explain to a person with hoarding behaviors that they may be having difficulty with categorizing or maybe experiencing the perfectionism that you talked about? It seems like that's something a therapist should be doing, right? I mean, would it be good for the average person to ask?
Good question. I think it all has to do with like the rapport with the person and the crisis that they're in. You know, one of the things is that if we are in true crisis, it's going to be very hard to kind of think logically about those things. You know, you're sitting outside your red tagged house and someone's going to say, oh, well, you know, you may have difficulty categorizing. There may be like a serotonin issue or like a temporal lobe. No, right? So but if it is in that therapeutic setting or a trusted person, absolutely. I think that those are very non-shaming, trait-based things that can help kind of get them curious maybe about those differences instead of just you are wrong, you hoard, right? So I find those things very interesting, and so the person may as well. And it may be a place to start with that conversation of, well, if there is a difference there, what can we do about it?
Okay, thank you, Krista. We've really run over on our time, and we thank you so much for that, Krista. This is just a compelling topic, and thank you for being with us today. If you did not get your questions answered, you can email the Hoarding Task Force or check out one of the other resources that Krista mentioned in her topic today. And also just be aware that, you know, we have this session was recorded. It will be available in our library online very soon, etc. So again, save the date of Tuesday, July 11th for pain management and dementia care, and be sure to visit our website for information about all of the many educational offerings that we make available through Alzheimer's Orange County. So thank you so much, Krista, for being our expert today on the hoarding dilemma. And we wish you good luck in the future with your new business.
Oh, thank you. Yes, come
Okay.
talk to me about puzzles.
Oh, okay, that with that teaser, let me also remind everyone that as we leave the webinar today, your evaluation will pop up. We need you to fill that out within 24 hours so that you will receive your certificate for your CE. Thanks, everyone, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.